All right, this week we are going to be moving into talking about the nervous system. You might notice from the syllabus that we're actually going to spend 3 weeks talking about the nervous system, and that is because it's pretty complicated. But this gives us a chance to go nice and slowly and explain everything. So the nervous system, it's really complicated, but also I hope you will find very cool. This first lecture, I'm mostly going to be introducing you to some of the terminology that we're going to be using to talk about the nervous system. Some of you might already be familiar with these terms, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page. One of the first things I wanted to talk about, a couple weeks ago, we covered the endocrine system in class. The nervous and endocrine systems have a lot in common. So first of all, they have a common function. They're both communication systems within the body. And although they're covered in separate chapters in the book, it was actually really quite a challenge for scientists to sort of figure out where is the dividing line between the nervous and endocrine systems. And that's because there's a lot of overlap between the two of them. So I wanted to start by just talking about some of those areas of overlap and how we do differentiate what's part of the nervous system and what's part of the endocrine system. So both are communication systems in the body. Generally, the endocrine system is going to be slower and have longer lasting effects. The nervous system can send messages in your body within a fraction of a second. Endocrine system signals have to travel through the blood, and depending on the hormone, they can take, days or weeks in some cases to have effects. But there's a lot of overlap, as I mentioned. One way that you have overlap is that some hormones are what are called neurohormones. So when we were talking about the endocrine system, we talked about the fact that a number of the endocrine tissues that produce hormones are actually neurons. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, which come from the adrenal medulla is actually neurons. So they're neurohormones. All the hypothalamic releasing hormones, they come from the hypothalamus, which is the brain and made of neurons. And all of the posterior pituitary hormones, because the posterior pituitary is also made of neurons. So neurohormones means that they are hormones, so chemical signals secreted into the blood, but the neuro prefix is because they're secreted by neurons. So some hormones are going to be made and released into the blood by neurons. There's also some hormones can act either as hormones, meaning secreted into the blood, or they can act as neurotransmitters. So chemical signals that are sent by neurons between two cells, not released into the blood, are called neurotransmitters. So some chemicals can do double duty as either a hormone if it's released into the blood, or a neurotransmitter if it's going to travel between a neuron and directly another cell. All right, another division that I wanted to talk about within the nervous system is that when we are thinking about the nervous system, as I mentioned, it's really big, really complicated. So there are a few different ways that scientists have come up with to sort of carve up the different parts of the nervous system. And probably the most fundamental division is when we refer to what's called the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. And that's a lot of words. So usually we call it the CNS and the PNS. So the central nervous system is going to consist of only two tissues in your body, the brain and the spinal cord. So as we'll discuss, those tissues are a little bit different from all your other nervous tissues. And the main thing that makes them different is the fact that they're involved in integrating information. So that word integrate might be a word that you've heard before, but maybe not in the context of the nervous system function. So integrating means bringing things together. So your brain and your spinal cord are both bringing in a lot of different information. So information from various neurons in your body, sometimes also information from the endocrine system. So they take all this information together and then they respond based on kind of summing together this information. So they're really kind of like decision-making tissues. The peripheral nervous system is basically everything else that's not the brain and the spinal cord. So some of these tissues have occasionally some integrating function, but generally the job of PNS tissues is going to be to just carry messages. They're not really making as many decisions as the tissues of the central nervous system. All right, I also wanted to introduce you to cells of the nervous system. So we talked about this very briefly in I guess it was lecture 4 when we were doing the introduction to anatomy and physiology, but now we're going to come back and talk about it in more detail. So the cells that get most of the attention in the nervous system are the neurons. So those are going to be the cells that generate electrical and chemical signals. They have some unique characteristics, one of which is that they have these long, what are called processes. So processes is just a fancy science word for branches. So they have these long branches that are called either axons or dendrites. So the difference between axons and dendrites is that axons are carrying information going out, so like outgoing mail, information that the neuron wants to send to other cells. Dendrites are going to be kind of like antenna, like radios have antennas, and they're going to be responsible for receiving incoming signals. So the axons of some neurons can be really, really long. So for example, the nerves that control the muscles in your toes, so they are going to reach all the way down to your toes. The cell body of that neuron is going to be in your spinal cord. So you're going to have an axon that goes all the way from your spine down to where your toes are. So sometimes those, if you're a very tall person, that can be a meter or more having those axons. So axons can sometimes be very long, although they're not always. Neurons have really diverse shapes related to their function. We'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. But neurons do all different kinds of things, right? They control your muscles, they pick up stimuli, so they respond to things like sound, light, chemicals. So neurons do really a tremendous amount of things, and that's reflected in the diversity of what neurons look like. So neurons account for less than 10% of the cells in the nervous system. The other 90% of cells are going to be what are called either neuroglia or glia or glial cells. I have apologized before for the fact that biology doesn't have any standardization of terms. I will say the nervous system is the absolute worst aspect of biology in that regard. So it's not uncommon for things to have 3 or 4 different names, and people use all of them because we have no standardization, unfortunately. So this is one of those terms that different people will just use different words to refer to it, but those words all mean the same thing. They're going to account for about 90% of the cells in your nervous system. And they have a lot of different roles, but basically they help to physically protect neurons. They're going to help neurons to send electrical signals. They're going to create a favorable chemical environment around neurons to help them function. So I often refer to neuroglia as being kind of like the entourage of the neurons, right? So if you see somebody like a celebrity like Kanye West, like a paparazzi photo of him, like there's Kanye, and then there's like 8 people around him, like holding his umbrella and, holding his coat and stuff, right? So those, Kanye is like the neuron there, and all the people around him are like the neuroglia that sort of help him to function. All right, so I mentioned before that neurons have really diverse shapes. That's illustrated here by showing you 3 different types of neurons. So here at the top, we have a sensory neuron that's involved in picking up sensory information. So it could be something like a chemical signal or a physical signal. For all of these pictures, the axons are shown in red, and the other parts of the neuron, including the dendrites and the cell body, are shown in black. So here we have a sensory neuron, which is going to carry information to the central nervous system. At the bottom, we have a motor neuron. So motor neurons are going to control the function of muscle tissue. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. The fact that skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle all have neurons that are going to control their function. And it's going to be this type of motor neuron. So it's carrying information from the central nervous system to muscles. And then we have a third class of neuron, which is shown in the middle, which are called interneurons. So interneurons, that prefix inter means between. So true to that name, they actually carry messages between sensory and motor neurons. So they act as kind of like a bridge between information coming into the nervous system, the central nervous system, and information going out of the central nervous system. Okay. We will talk about this more in a later lecture, but I did want to also just introduce you to the fact that many neurons are what are called myelinated. So myelin is a substance that looks kind of fatty. It is actually made from specific types of neuroglial cells that wrap themselves around the axon of a neuron. So here we have the picture of the neuron, here's the cell body, here's the axon, and these little things that kind of look like beads, that is the myelin that's wrapped around the axon. So there's different types of neuroglial cells. Two of them make up myelin. So in the peripheral nervous system, myelin is made from a type of neuroglial cell called Schwann cells. And in the central nervous system, it's made from a different type of neuroglial cell called oligodendrocytes. But they both do the same thing. They both wrap themselves around the axon. We'll talk more about how that is going to contribute to the neuron's function in a later lecture, but basically for now, I'll just say that it helps to speed up the transmission of electrical signals down the length of the axon. And that can be really meaningful in those cases that I mentioned earlier where the axon is really long. So if you have an axon that's a meter long because you're tall and you have that axon going from your spine to your toe, that myelin can really be important in terms of being able to very quickly send signals to your toe from your brain.